Today. Today is Monday, 12th August. There continues to be considerable fog of war about the situation in Kursk region, though my own view is that the fog of war is gradually lifting and we can get a fairly clear sense of the whole situation. And of course, we've had dramatic news from many parts of the Donbas battlefronts, and we've also had an attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Now, it's not always entirely easy to discuss these, to decide where to begin in discussing all of these various different disparate events. The big news yesterday, the one that was attracting by far the most attention, was the drone attack. I'm convinced it was a drone attack, by the way, on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. The Ukrainians, as I read in The Guardian, were claiming that the fire, the smoke that was seen rising from the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant was a fake, concocted by the Russians themselves, that they apparently or allegedly or supposedly collected large numbers of tires and set them on fire in order to create a column of smoke which could be mistaken for the result of a Ukrainian drone attack. I'm afraid I do not believe these claims. The US media in the past has told us that has confirmed that the Ukrainians have indeed shelled the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. As I understand it, the damage that was done as a result of this latest drone attack was significant, but not yet dangerous. I'm going to return to the topic of the attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, because to my mind, it is connected with the developments in Kursk region. And since it is these which continue to dominate the international media, I intend to talk about them. I intend to talk about this topic mostly, at least at the beginning of this program. Now, on that topic, there's a number of important things I do want to say. The first is when I discuss the actual events on the battlegrounds, I think my own conclusion will become fairly clear, which is that not only is the Ukrainian offensive failing, but it is now, in effect, reversing, and that the Ukrainians have walked into a trap, either one that they made for themselves, or one which perhaps, just possibly, conceivably, the Russians might have set for them. I'm still uncertain about the last possibility for various reasons, which I'm going to discuss later in this program. Well, I have to say that in the meantime, it continues to be the case that the actual information from the battlefronts is not easy sometimes to process. We're still looking at a very chaotic, very fluid situation. The Ukrainians still send, or try to send, small groups of troops moving in all kinds of directions within the Kursk region. It's clear that a front line has not yet been fully established. So it would be, I think, misleading to say that the situation is stabilizing. But I think that when one grinds through all the information, we're getting a clear sense now that the Russians now most emphatically do have the initiative and are gradually gaining control of the situation. In fact, my own view is that it's probably the case, or possibly the case, that over the last 24 hours, the pendulum has swung decisively back to the Russians, and it could be that many of these places that we've been hearing mentioned in various reports that have appeared on various Telegram channels as being Ukrainian captures are now back fully and securely under Russian control. But I don't want to go into the weeds too much on this, because there's still inconsistent information, and it's not always easy to get a complete picture, as I said, of what's going on. It is very important, however, to keep a level head and to understand, or to try to understand, the nature of this operation. To repeat again, what were the Ukrainians actually trying to achieve in a military sense by starting this operation? There's been lots of discussion. There's been discussion about the Ukrainians trying to get the Russians to divert their forces from the Donbas to Kursk region. No evidence, as I said, that this has happened to any extent. There's been some claims that the Russians have deployed forces from the Kharkiv front. I think that this is a misunderstanding. I think that, on the contrary, the latest reports suggest that the Russians are reinforcing their grouping, which is in the process of capturing Volchansk in Kharkiv region. And there are, in fact, reports that the last buildings in the so-called citadel area, the area of the high-rise buildings, the area where the Ukrainians have made their most determined stand in Volchansk, is about to fall. But I have made the point in multiple programs over the course of my various discussions about the fighting in Kharkiv region, that one of the most interesting facts about the fighting in Kharkiv region is that, with a few exceptions, group of forces north has held back its heavy mechanized units, its tank and mechanized infantry units from the battle in Volchansk and in Kharkiv region. They've remained across the border in Belgorod region and elsewhere along the border, not, I think, in order to counter any Ukrainian attacks, but because the Russians are holding back these forces in reserve so that they can exploit the advantage that will come to them when Volchansk eventually falls. And in the meantime, it's probably true that the Russians have redeployed some of these mechanized units and some of these armored units to Kursk region to basically help stabilize the situation there. The troops, the units that are close to this area, they can be rapidly redeployed, and I'm guessing that that is exactly what has happened. Now, the Russians have enormous reserves. They have many units deep inside Russia. Many of them are staffed by conscripts doing their one-year service. They would be capable of being used under Russian law to contest the Ukrainian forces in Kursk region for understandable reasons. The Russians are unwilling to do this, and so for the moment they have been deploying contract troops, again from deep inside Russia, the Wagner forces, the Akhmat special forces units, which have been redeployed to this area from Kharkiv region, units like that, and also some other contract units in the Russian army, of which there is also a substantial reserve. But there is no sign, to repeat again, that the Russians have redeployed forces from the Donbas, and there are now growing alarm and concern amongst various pro-Ukrainian Western commentators and even some Ukrainian military officials that this is the case. The Ukrainians seem to be surprised that the Russians have not responded in the way that perhaps they hoped they would by redeploying forces from Donbas to Kursk region. On the contrary, as we will see, the Russian offensive in Donbas continues unabated. And we've got concerns expressed by all kinds of people, by Michael Clark in the London Times, by Mark Galliotti in The Spectator, by The Economist, in which a Ukrainian officer says that the Russians are not stupid. They understand the mistake they would be making if they redeployed their forces from the Donbas, and that they know that if the Ukrainians try and advance too far, he spoke about distances of 80 to 100 kilometers inside Russia, they would quickly exhaust their supply lines. They would quickly run beyond their supply lines, making them easy targets for the Russians to mop up. So we could see these expressions of alarm. They're not always there in all of the Western commentary, but you can see them squirreled away. There is more doubt about this operation that the Ukrainians are conducting than I have ever seen before, even amongst many of Ukraine's most fervid supporters. Anyway, so that clearly, in my mind, was not the primary Ukrainian objective. They must have some idea of the scale of the Russian armed forces. General Syrskyi, the Ukrainian military commander, about 2 weeks ago gave an interview to The Guardian in which he spoke about the total size of the Russian armed forces and how they're increasing in size all the time. He must have realized, he must know, that the Russians have ample forces that they could redeploy to contain a Ukrainian advance into Kursk region. So, to repeat again, what was the Ukrainian objective? Holding territory in Kursk region, as we're going to see, is going to prove impossibly difficult. And in fact, there's clear signs now that the Ukrainians are starting to lose territory, that some of the areas that they have indisputably controlled, they are starting to lose. So, what were the Ukrainian objectives? Well, I have expressed them. I have explained them many times, or at least my own view about what they were many, many times. I have personally no doubt at all that when the Ukrainians advanced into Kursk region, their objective was the town of Kurchatov and the nuclear power station that is located there, the Kursk nuclear power station. And I've speculated about other potential Russian military facilities connected with Russia's military nuclear deterrent forces that might have been concentrated in this area. I've specifically pointed out that the very name of the town close to which the nuclear power station is located, Kurchatov, strongly suggests that it is connected in some way, that it has some facilities there that are connected, or had some facilities there that were connected to the development of Russia's strategic nuclear forces. Kurchatov being Russia's equivalent of Oppenheimer. He was the scientist who was in overall charge of Russia's atomic bomb project in the 1940s. Like Oppenheimer, undoubtedly, by the way, on the basis of some information obtained about the American project by Soviet spies, though this is in no way to deny Kurchatov's brilliance as a scientist, or that of the other scientists like Hariton and Sakharov, who were working for him. Undoubtedly, the Soviets did get help from some of their nuclear spies. But anyway, the point is that it's very difficult to believe, at least I find it very difficult to believe, that a town that the Soviet Union named after a scientist with that kind of background would not have some kind of important military facilities connected to the Soviet Union's own nuclear weapons program. And interestingly enough, just yesterday, I got another email from the same source. The source has just pointed out to, who suggested to me that this entire Ukrainian operation in Kursk region that has played out has been to some extent the product of a trap intentionally laid out for the Ukrainians by the Russians. Just to repeat again, the source, extremely well informed, highly reliable, and as he correctly pointed out to me, he actually forewarned me that this raid in Kursk region was coming as far back as 2 months ago, and said that the Russians were aware of the Ukrainian intentions to carry out this raid. Anyway, this person has informed me that there is actually another facility, another storage facility located south of Kursk, where the Russians keep warheads, store warheads for some of their tactical systems, including their Iskander-M missiles. The Iskander-M, which is a missile which has been prolifically active over the course of the current conflict, can also carry a nuclear warhead. And some of these nuclear warheads, supposedly, are stored in this specific facility, which is located to the south of Kursk. Now, what else is located to the south of Kursk, to the southwest of Kursk, to be precise? Well, the town of Kurchatov and the Kursk nuclear power plant. Now, let me stress again, I am not saying that this facility is located in Kurchatov, because I don't know. I don't know this for a fact. The information about the location of these facilities that this source has provided me in the past has been consistently correct, but the source has told me that he is not himself quite sure where this storage facility is located. But it could be, let's put it like this, it could be, assuming it exists, which I'm no doubt that it does, it could be located in Kurchatov or in the area around it. The source does say that he's not sure whether those warheads are actually there in the facility at this time. Who knows? I don't know. Nobody can say apart from the Russians. The Russians, of course, will know. Perhaps, given the Ukrainian incursion, the Russians have moved them. Just making that point. But the point is, apparently there is such a facility located south of Kursk. So all of this conceivably makes for an attractive target. The Ukrainians would have known that this entire area in Kursk region was short of troops, short of strong Russian regular units. My own view is that the Russians took a deliberate decision to withdraw most of their heavy units deeper inside Russia because they were concerned, probably over the course of the last few weeks, that the Ukrainians would start launching missile strikes against these units, because after all, that has been widely discussed in the Western media. The Ukrainians have been pleading with the Americans for permission to launch missile strikes on Russian facilities and Russian troop concentrations across the border using ATACMS and Storm Shadows. And I've even floated the possibility, as I remember, some weeks ago when this story was being most widely discussed, that the Ukrainians even might be planning to launch missile strikes against the Kursk nuclear power station, which, to my knowledge, according to the Russians, according to Putin himself, they have sent sabotage groups to try to damage covertly in the past. So I think the Russians, for those reasons, probably pulled their troops back from the border, their heavy mechanized units on the border, immediate area of the border. The Ukrainians got wind of this fact. They took advantage also of the fact that the Russians had apparently cleared their own minefields, maybe in preparation for an offensive in Sumy region, which adjoins Kursk region inside Ukraine. And, well, the Chinese media has also been saying that there was a troop rotation by the Russians going on at around this time. And that also meant that this area was temporarily short of troops. And anyway, for all of these reasons, the Ukrainians seized their chance and launched their raid. And I have no doubt that their objective was Kurchatov. The Russian media, Radovka, for example, are now straightforwardly saying this. If you go to the Russian media, maybe not the official news agencies like Novosti and TASS, but if you go to the Russian newspapers, Radovka, for example, they now take it as fact that the objective of the Ukrainians in launching this attack was to reach and capture Kurchatov and some of the facilities there and the nuclear power plant itself. And apparently, I say apparently, because I haven't seen them, there have been a succession of interviews, and I believe that these have been recorded and published by the Russians, but if so, I have not seen them. Apparently, there have been interviews in which Ukrainian prisoners captured by the Russians in Kursk region have also been saying that the objective that they were given was to capture the nuclear power station. Now, I ought to make it clear, by the way, that at this point, that on principle, I never watch videos of prisoners of war who've been made or have been encouraged to say things by their captors. I don't do this for any conflict in any place. I find this kind of thing extremely disturbing when it happens. And I would also say that I regard witness testimony, this kind of public testimony by prisoners, as inherently unreliable. So I'm not basing anything very much on it. But for what it's worth, this testimony exists. The Russians, as I said, take the view that the Kurchatov and the nuclear power plant were the objectives, and it makes sense that Kurchatov and the nuclear power plant was the objective, because there is nothing else in this region that could explain or justify an attack of this kind. Deploying 5 brigades of crack troops to capture a small number of tiny hamlets and villages, and the town of Suja, which we've been hearing so much about over the last couple of days, is the largest place by far that the Ukrainians have attacked, and it apparently has a population of between 5,000 and 6,000 people. So if it's a town, which it is, it's a very small place. Well, there is no rationale and logic in trying to devote 5 entire brigades to an operation of that kind. The idea that capturing these small villages would somehow dismay the Russians, divert them from their course, makes absolutely no sense to me. And I can't believe that even the Ukrainians and their Western backers would have believed it, though of course I'm to some extent making assumptions there. And to those who speak about Kursk as Russian territory, let me repeat again a point that I made in my program yesterday. As far as the Russians are concerned, or at any rate as far as the Russian authorities are concerned, including of course President Putin himself, all of the territory in Donbas and Zaporozhye and Kherson region that is currently being contested is Russian territory. So the fact that the Ukrainians are fighting the Russians in Kursk region may seem like a massive difference to Westerners, but it may not seem quite like that to some people in Moscow, some important people in Moscow. Certainly not enough, at any rate, to force them to change tack or to alter their course of events. If a nuclear power plant, laboratories, maybe, if they exist, in Kurchatov, a storage facility for tactical nuclear weapons, even if that storage facility were empty, well, that, of course, would be a completely different matter. And, of course, if the Ukrainians arrived at the Kursk nuclear power plant and were able to entrench themselves there, even if they were far from their comrades further west, it might be difficult for the Russians to engage them in a battle on the territory of the nuclear power plant itself, given the sensitive nature of this facility. And the Ukrainians might calculate that if they did dig in, the Russians would be forced to engage them in some kind of negotiation. And I think that was the Ukrainian plan. And Redovka, I notice, has now provided its own account of what happened. It said that the Ukrainian plan was to capture the nuclear power plant on the very first day of the operation. That is to say, over the course of the night of the 6th of August, to send a flying column of troops up the main road through Suja to Kurchatov itself, seizing Kurchatov. The remaining Ukrainian brigades would then occupy Suja and all of these other places. And that would mean that the Ukrainian forces were located within close distance of the Ukrainian advance force that had occupied the nuclear power plant, and then that would indeed have created an enormous crisis for the Putin government in Moscow, had that plan actually succeeded. But it failed, and the reason it failed, and I've discussed this already, is because the Ukrainians failed to capture Suja on the first day. In fact, they have not captured Suja at all. And exactly as I speculated, when it became clear that Suja would not fall and that it would not be possible to move up the main road to Kurchatov, the Ukrainians attempted alternative routes, the most important of which was through the village of Korenovo, though the Ukrainians also seem to have tried to advance northwards towards Kurchatov along a smaller road through Malaya Loknia to Kromsky Biki. All of these attacks having subsequently been repulsed by the Russians. Now, over the course of one of my earlier programs, I also mentioned that one of the very first things that the Russians would do after the Ukrainians began this incursion was to rush troops to the area of the Kursk nuclear power plant to secure the area around the nuclear power plant and whatever other facilities are located there, and to make sure that that area, first and foremost, was secure. And this would have been an even more pressing priority than containing the various Ukrainian forces that were rampaging elsewhere in Kursk region, and that would give the Ukrainians 2, perhaps 3 days of being able to occupy various empty villages, empty of troops, whilst the Russians secured the nuclear power station. And yesterday, sure enough, the satellite pictures appeared, showing that the Russians have established fortified positions around the Kursk nuclear power plant. They built trenches and other fortifications around it. And that is exactly what, in this situation, one would expect them to do. So, there it is. This is exactly, as I said, as might have been predicted. Let me repeat again, I'm not setting myself up as some great strategist reading, trying to second guess what the Ukrainians were trying to do. All it takes, it seems to me, is to examine the territory, look where the Ukrainians are, and it's possible both to understand the Ukrainian movements and to understand the Russian counter-responses. And it's a reasonable guess that there are still substantial Russian forces around the Kursk nuclear power plant occupying these fortifications that have been created around Kurchatov itself. Probably there are special forces units that are located there. I'm guessing some of them sent from Moscow itself, and it's likely that now the Russians consider that the nuclear power plant is fully secure. And this now brings me to the situation that we have currently ongoing in Kursk region, because there is considerable fog of war still. And here again, I want to make one observation, which I made before at various points over the course of this conflict, that the mere presence of a Ukrainian or indeed Russian armoured vehicle close to a particular village does not mean that the Ukrainians or the Russians control that particular village, especially in a dynamic battle like the one that is flaring in Kursk region. We're going to see lots of units, flying units, reconnaissance, sabotage and reconnaissance groups, as the Russians and the Ukrainians like to refer to them, moving about along the roads at great speed, covering vast distances, or several tens of kilometers at a time. They pass through various villages. They're caught in the open by the Russians. The Russians destroy the vehicles. The men jump out of the vehicles. Eventually they're hunted down by the Russians. We'll come to all of that in a moment. But it doesn't mean that the fact that there are all of these sabotage and reconnaissance groups moving around the various villages, it doesn't mean necessarily that these villages are controlled, in this particular case of Kursk region, by the Ukrainians. This is, as I said, a fluid battle, and there are no clear front lines, at least not for the moment, though it does seem to be the case that the situation is now being brought by the Russians under control. Now, let's first of all begin with what the Russian Defense Ministry has told us about the situation this morning. And over the last few hours, the Russian Defense Ministry has published its latest update, and I will read it. The armed forces of the Russian Federation continue to repel the Ukrainian attempt to invade the territory of the Russian Federation. Over the past 24 hours, active actions of units of the Group of Forces North and Allied reserves, army aviation, unmanned aerial vehicles and artillery strikes repelled 7 attacks launched by assault detachments of the Ukrainian 80th and 82nd Air Assault Brigades near Martinovka, Borki and Korenovo. Now it's important to note again these 2 places that the Russians, 3 places that the Russians are talking about, and in particular to focus on the 2 most important ones. Martinovka, which is this village that lies to the northeast of Suja, along the main road from Kursk. As we will see, there is unequivocal confirmation that the Russians are in full control of Martinovka, and Korenovo, the other village well to the west, to the north, well to the west rather, of Suja, which was the other line that the Ukrainians tried to follow as they tried to battle through towards the nuclear power plant. And notice that the Ukrainians carried out assaults on these 2 places. These were actual assaults carried out by assault detachments of the 80th and 82nd Airborne Assault Brigades. In other words, these 2 brigades, paratroopers, Ukrainian paratroopers, who have been tasked with spearheading this attack, they're still seeking to try to break through, or at least to capture Korenovo and Suja, and according to the Russians, they're failing. And then the Russian Defense Ministry goes on to say this: the attempts of the enemy's mobile groups on armored vehicles to get to the depth of Russian territory were thwarted. The Ukrainian losses have amounted to 1 tank, 8 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 16 armored fighting vehicles, and 14 pickup trucks. Now, I'm going to discuss these armored vehicle losses by the Ukrainians shortly, because there is a great deal to be said about. There's a great deal to say about these. And then the report from the Defense Ministry goes on to tell us this: ground attack and army aviation and artillery strikes have inflicted losses on manpower and hardware clusters on the Ukrainian 22nd, 61st and 115th Mechanized brigades near Kurilovka, Plekhovo, Lyubimovka, Suja, Kositsa, Gogolyevka, Kazachia, Loknaya, Mikhailovka and Sverdlyakovka. Now, I've been able to locate all of these places except from Sverdlyakovka, and I would say that all of them appear to be located in a cluster around Suja itself. And as we will see, as I will discuss shortly, it looks as if the Russians are now clearing the Ukrainians from Suja. So there's 3 Ukrainian mechanized brigades located just across the border, clustered around Suja. The Russians have been attacking them with their aircraft and artillery, even as their assault forces have been breaking through and pushing the Ukrainians out of Suja itself. And at the same time as that has been happening, the Ukrainians, using light infantry paratroopers, tried to make another attempt to break through to Martinovka and Korenovo, but failed. And the Ukrainians are still trying to send what the Russians call sabotage and reconnaissance groups deep into Russian territory. And again, the Ukrainians were caught in the open by the Russians, according to the Russian Defense Ministry, losing up to 18 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles and 16 armoured fighting vehicles and 14 trucks. And we are then told that by the Defense Ministry, the Russian Defense Ministry, that over the past, aviation and missile troops delivered strikes at Ukrainian reserves near Miropolye, Mogritsa, Dobrovshina, and on the territory of Sumy region. So the Russians have been bombing and launching missile strikes on the Ukrainian reserves in Kursk region. And then the Russians give us, the Defense Ministry gives us an update on Ukrainian losses. Over the past 24 hours, Ukrainian losses have amounted to 260 Ukrainian troops, 31 units of hardware, including 3 tanks, 8 infantry fighting vehicles, these are the Bradleys, 20 armoured fighting vehicles, 27 motor vehicles, and 103 122 millimeter D20 howitzers. Since the beginning of the hostilities in Kursk region, Ukrainian losses have amounted to 1,610 Ukrainian troops, those are killed and wounded, 32 tanks, 23 armoured personnel carriers, 17 infantry fighting vehicles, 136 armoured fighting vehicles, 47 motor vehicles, 4 surface-to-air missile systems, of which we know that one basically was a Patriot missile system, 1 multiple launch rocket system, and 13 field artillery pieces. And the report finishes, the operation to neutralize the Ukrainian units is in progress. So this is what the Russian Defense Ministry says. And note one very interesting fact, which is that though Ukrainian manpower losses are very high, 1,610 troops killed and wounded since the 6th of August. So it's been a costly operation in terms of manpower. As the same person who has mentioned to me the fact that there is a nuclear weapons storage facility located in Kursk region, and who previously tipped me off that this operation, something like this operation was coming, and, well, sure enough, it has happened. This person has pointed out to me that there is an imbalance as compared with earlier other battles between Ukrainian troop losses and Ukrainian armored vehicle losses. 1,610 men is an awful lot, but then this is an offensive, and it is not by any means the highest losses that the Ukrainians have suffered, manpower losses that the Ukrainians have suffered in an operation of this kind. The Russians are deliberately targeting Ukrainian tanks and armoured vehicles. They've just, according to what they say, destroyed 8 Bradleys. These are probably irrecoverable. They will be located deep inside Russian-controlled territory, and they have destroyed 32 tanks. Some of these armoured vehicles may be recoverable. The Ukrainians have published film showing that they've also managed to capture and move back to their own lines 1 or 2 Russian tanks, but still the armoured vehicle losses are extremely high. Indeed, one report that I saw said that they're starting to approach the scale of losses that the Ukrainians experienced over the course of their Zaporozhye offensive in summer of last year. So the Russians appear to be focusing on destroying the Ukrainian armored vehicle park. They know that the Ukrainians are short of armored vehicles, and they seem to be systematically picking them off. The infantry can be mopped up later. Now, we've also had reports from various reporting agencies. Now, again, it's been striking to me that there seems to be a bias, including on the part of some Russian bloggers and reporters, to base their accounts on what the Ukrainians have been telling us about the progress of this battle, which I have to say I find a little strange. The Ukrainians do sometimes provide accurate information, but then so do the Russians. And as I've said many times, overall, over the course of this war, I've tended to find the Russians rather more reliable than the Ukrainians. But given the political investment that the Ukrainians, as well as the Russians, have in this battle, one should be particularly wary, it seems to me, on relying disproportionately on one side as opposed to another. I've just heard, for example, on the Military Summary channel, a very complicated account by that comes from the Ukrainians about a very complicated battle that is supposed to have happened over the course of the last 24 hours for the village of Martinovka, which is, of course, located close to Suja. Supposedly, the Russians entered it, were pushed out. The Ukrainians then gained complete control of Martinovka. Then the Russians attacked. Then there was a lot of complicated battles. But the long and the short of it is that the Russians are indeed in control of Martinovka. I believe that the Russians captured Martinovka about 2 days ago, or at least 36 hours ago. That is what the Russians have been saying. That's what General Alaudinov, who is a military officer, Russian military officer in this area, he's Chechen of nationality, but he's an officer of the Russian army, has been saying. I've never had any reasons to doubt this. There's been images, film showing Russian troops in Martinovka. It seems to me that we don't need to engage in speculations about long and complicated battles in which the village changes hands several times. The Russian Defense Ministry has said very simply that there have been a Ukrainian assault on Martinovka carried out by troops, paratroopers of the 80th Brigade, and that the Russians have repulsed it. I don't think there's any reason to think that there's been anything more complicated than that. But we have had reports, what look to me confirmed reports, including from Alaudinov himself, which show the Russians now deep inside Suja. It's quite clear to me that the Russians are now systematically pushing the Ukrainians out of Suja. They seem to be close to the western outskirts of Suja. The Ukrainians are still located in these western outskirts. They're still able to move their armored vehicles and their cars up and down a road that's located to the west of Suja. But within Suja itself, the Russians are gradually squeezing them out. And there are also reports that the Russians have captured various other villages as well. They seem to be closing the ring around Suja in particular. And this is where we come back to the account that the Russian Defense Ministry gave. As I said, all of those villages, Plekhovo, Lyubimovka, Suja, Kozitska, Kodolyeva, Kazachaya, Lokna, Mikhailovka, and Sverdlyakova, as I said, are located around Suja. The Russians are conducting heavy artillery and bombing strikes on the Ukrainian troops around these places. And this is consistent with a general Russian counterattack underway to regain control of Suja. Know that the Russians have secured the nuclear power station and Kurchatov. They're able to concentrate on doing that, and that's exactly what they're doing. And they're moving more and more forces there, and they've recaptured Martinovka. There are reports that they have recaptured Malaya Loknaya. Again, this isn't fully confirmed, but there are reports that they've done that. There was a report that they've also secured Lebedyevka. If they're shelling the Ukrainians in Kazachia, Loknya, it could be that they're preparing to attack the Ukrainians there as well. So gradually, the ring around Suja is closing, and that, it seems to me, is what the Russians are doing. They're gradually working to push the Ukrainians out of Suja. Now, further to the west, around the village of Korenovo, the situation clearly remains more unstable. But the Ukrainians, as I said, they failed to capture the nuclear power plant or any of these other military facilities. They have a decision now to make about what they're going to do. Are they going to persist with this offensive, or are they going to pull back? And unsurprisingly, given that the Ukrainian army takes its orders ultimately from Zelensky, they seem to be trying to dig in, trying to keep their forces around Suja, where the Russians are able to bomb and shell them and bring up more forces and gradually take these forces apart. Now, this, as I said, is starting to look like a trap. Going back to what that source told me, he told me 2 months ago, he warned me 2 months ago that the Russians were aware that this was coming. It may be that the Russians, when Belousov telephoned Austin, wanted to know whether the Americans were involved in some way in this operation that they knew were coming. Maybe the Russians did intentionally set up a trap. I expressed doubts yesterday. I said that it seemed to me out of character with the Russian high command that they would do something like this. They seem to me to be very risk-averse people. I said also that it seemed to me inconsistent with Putin's personality, that he would put Russian civilians at risk. Another source, completely different source, has pointed out to me that Putin might make that decision if he was told that luring the Ukrainian brigades in to Kursk region, where they could be defeated and destroyed in this way, would spare the lives of Russian soldiers further on. I mean, that's a serious point, actually. But anyway, whether or not the Russians intentionally set a trap, about which, by the way, I still have doubts, or whether the Ukrainians have walked into a trap that they have made for themselves, together with all of these other Western commentators I was talking about, Mark Galeotti, Julian Repke, Michael Clark, well, they wouldn't go as far as me. In fact, they wouldn't go anywhere near as far as me. But it seems to me that, to some extent, this is what they're all becoming worried about, that this is how the situation is developing, that the Ukrainians moved into Kursk region, occupied a few villages and hamlets of no, as I said, major significance. They're being heavily bombed by the Russians. They're suffering heavy losses. their armoured forces, already thin on the ground, are being particularly heavily depleted. And in the meantime, everywhere else, the front lines are collapsing. There is something else as well to say about this. Now, this force that carried out this attack in Kursk, this Ukrainian force, appears to have been put together in a great hurry. Some of the units appear to have been pulled back from the border with Belarus. Others, specifically I understand the paratroop units, were involved in battles on the combat line. According, I think, to The Economist, some of them were given just a day's notice that they were being redeployed in order to participate in this offensive in Kursk. So, firstly, the main battlefronts in Donbas were thinned of important, valuable and experienced troops in order to carry out this mad dash to seize the nuclear power plant and the surrounding facilities. But also, I suspect that some of the best military units who had been held back as Ukraine's last important reserve were committed to this battle also. And I've seen it suggested, though I cannot remember where, that these units, specifically the mechanized units that are now being pounded by the Russians around Suja, were the core force that was shielding Kiev itself. Now, if that is right, then especially if the Russians do have some long-term objective to move on to Kiev, this could be a particularly costly thing for the Ukrainians to do. Now, anyway, we're not over yet. The Ukrainians have assembled a substantial force in Sumy region and along the border in Kursk region. They're still rattling around, trying to capture empty villages. I think this is very much a necessity now in order to keep morale high and to keep this operation, at least to give the impression that this operation is succeeding, even as it is clearly failing. There is a possibility that the Ukrainians might launch further attacks in Kursk region. The authorities in one part of Kursk region have ordered, or rather have advised the civilians to evacuate from a village which the Ukrainians sought to move towards over the course of last night. The Russians have also conducted an evacuation of part of Belgorod region, another area which borders on Ukraine. All of this, what you would expect the Russians to do in this kind of situation. But as I said, it is, after all, what they are doing. It's possible that the Ukrainians, as I said, have some more tricks up their sleeve. But as things stand, they are bogged down around Suja. They failed to capture the nuclear power plant. Their troops are pinned down along the border. Valuable and experienced men are being lost in pointless battles to try to capture villages. And the Russians have the Ukrainians basically out in the open, and they're able to destroy them, to destroy their tanks and their armoured vehicles in substantial numbers. 8 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles destroyed in a single day and in a single place. 32 tanks lost. perhaps even more critically, 4 surface-to-air missile systems, 3 Book M systems, probably Frankenstein systems, using American missiles, but also a Patriot missile system. All of those destroyed for an operation that isn't achieving what its authors, what its planners, whoever they were, originally intended. And I'm going to suggest that this again brings us back to the attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, what that attack was all about. There's been lots of speculation that the Ukrainians are themselves considering an attack on the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and it's possible. Though the Russians, I am sure, are there in force, and various previous Ukrainian attacks to capture the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant have been catastrophic failures, and of course the Ukrainians, very short of men now and machines, overcommitted on one of the front lines. It might be a stretch for them to do. But they have now launched drone attacks against the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And, well, there might be various explanations for this. There might be a way for the Ukrainians to say, well, look, the nuclear power plant is not safe. The Russians aren't safeguarding it properly. We need to bring it back under control, and that justifies us attacking it. It might be that that is what the Ukrainians are going to do. But to me, it looks like a spasm, another tantrum. One of the things which I strongly suspect that the Ukrainians were intending to do over the course of a negotiation that they were, I think, intending to undertake if they had managed to capture the Kursk nuclear power plant, is to ask to bargain the return of the Kursk nuclear power plant to the Russians in return for the Russians surrendering the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant back to them. Well, that hasn't happened, and they responded perhaps rather petulantly to that failure with this attack. At least that is how it seems to me. There might be, as I said, more to it. We'll just have to wait and see. Now, let me now finish this discussion of this particular battle, which has taken up a long time in this program, and it's, by the way, a disproportionate amount of time, because the main battle in this conflict is not going on in Kursk. It continues to be in Donbas, as we will shortly see. But let me finish quickly this rundown of what's going on in the Kursk battle by referring to a truly outstanding video that Rus Retakes has done about this battle, pointing out again on the new atlas that this whole operation, all that it is going to do is accelerate Ukraine's inevitable eventual collapse. And I agree. I think the Ukrainians have lost a huge amount of goodwill. I think they made the Russians even more determined as a result of this attack to see this whole war through, and even less persuaded that negotiating with the team in Kiev is a good idea. One has to go to the Russian media and follow what Russian officials have been saying to get a full sense of that. But anyway, Rus Retakes has made, in his discussion, I think a simply outstanding and very simple point. He says that if you look at the front line, the Ukrainians have been on the retreat everywhere. Every part of the front line, they have been retreating. And the reason that they're retreating is because by their own admission, you find heaps of admissions about this all over the Ukrainian blogosphere. By their own admission, they're now critically overextended. They don't have enough men to hold their positions everywhere that the Russians are grinding them. So, what they have done, instead of shortening their front line in order to make it more coherent and more defendable, they have instead extended it. They've extended it by sending 5 of their best divisions on a fool's errand in Kursk region. And I think this is absolutely right. This sums up the complete lack of logic behind this entire operation. Just saying. Well, there we are. Let's actually now look at what is actually going on the front lines. I'm going to cover all of this rather more quickly than I usually do, but briefly, let's begin from the south and go up northwards. So in the south, the 79th Air Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian army, the people who have been stalwartly defending first Novomikhailivka and then Pantelimovka, and are now fighting bitterly for the village of Konstantinovka, north of Vuhledar. They've now straightforwardly admitted that the Russians control most of the distance of the road between Konstantinovka and Vuhledar. The Russians are well beyond the road. They have captured nearly most of this territory of the road, and they've moved west beyond it. Konstantinovka itself, we've had less information about, but there's film and photographic evidence which has appeared over the last couple of days, which clearly shows the Russians well inside Konstantinovka. I'm going to make a guess that around 40% of Konstantinovka, which is a big village, is by now either directly contested or under full Russian control. But perhaps more important still, the Russians have not only moved west of the road, but they are now close to the village of Odyanye, west of the road as well. They captured this village, then they are well on the way to moving westwards, to reaching the next supply road to Vuhledar from Kurachovo further west, and cutting that road as well. In which case, Vuhledar, not only the garrison, the Ukrainian garrison at Vuhledar, not only is cut off from its 2 main supply roads, but is dangerously close to being fully encircled. A cauldron is developing around Vuhledar. It'll be interesting to see again what the Ukrainian command does. Does it withdraw its forces from Vuhledar, understanding that the place has now become undefendable? Or does it insist that its troops remain there, fight on to the last, in which case there would be a bitter battle, but with the Ukrainians cut off in Vuhledar and encircled there? It would be a battle a little bit like the Battle of Mariupol, in fact, closer to the Battle of Mariupol than anything we have seen up to now. A Ukrainian force fully encircled by the Russians in a classical siege type situation, obliged either to go on fighting or to lay down its arms, perhaps eventually following the pattern of what happened in Mariupol, choosing to lay down its arms. Anyway, we are coming measurably closer to that point. Now, we've had less information from the Krasnogorovka area for some time. The Russians, undoubtedly, there's now indisputable confirmation that they control the village of Nivolskoye, north of Krasnogorovka. The latest reports were that they're pushing along the two remaining roads that make up Krasnogorovka, that move westwards from Krasnogorovka. It seems that the Russians are gradually moving along these roads towards Kurakhovo itself. It looks as if a battle for Kurakhovo, the main supply base for the Ukrainians in this part of Donbas, is about to begin. Now, in the Pokrovsk area, I think it's more accurate to say now the Pokrovsk area, lots of film and pictures and commentaries about the battle that's now taking place in Grodivka, the village along the road from Progress, which leads to Mirnograd and Pokrovsk itself. Mirnograd and Pokrovsk form a single conurbation. Mirnograd, incidentally, is an entirely Soviet creation. It was a kind of industrial suburb of Pokrovsk, created by the Soviets, basically for the coal mining industry, so I understand. And its former Soviet name was Dimitrov, named after the former leader of communist Bulgaria, the leader of the first communist government in Bulgaria, who was a celebrated figure within the international communist movement. Mirnograd is an entirely post-2014 name. Anyway, the Russians fighting inside Mirnograd. There's conclusive confirmation that they've captured Ivanivka. It looks as if the Ukrainian defenses in this area, Grodivka, are now collapsing. And if Grodivka is captured, well, the way to Pokrovsk itself is open. The first defense line around Pokrovsk will have been pierced, and the Russians will soon be in the actual metropolitan built-up area of Pokrovsk itself, which is a large place, around 60,000 people, but perhaps not an adequately defended one, just saying. Also in this area, there are reports that the Russians have now effectively captured around 2/3 of Zelanye. To repeat reports from a couple of days ago, it seems that a Ukrainian grouping in Zelanye is now completely encircled. We don't have huge amount of details about this, but anyway, that does seem to be the major situation there. Anyway, the thing to say is that the fighting in Zelanye apparently is interesting because it seems that Zelanye was where the Ukrainians maintained their command post in the area of Pokrovsk for some time. So the Russians have effectively managed to capture the main Ukrainian, or at least are in the process of capturing the main Ukrainian command area in the area close to Pokrovsk. Anyway, to move on, the most dramatic news over the last 24 hours has been in the Toretsk area. It's now clear that the Ukrainians have indeed completely abandoned the territory south of the Pioneer Highway. The Russians are now in full control of this area, and their forces, their units have, between the villages of Zalizny and New-York, have basically been combined, and that there is now a continuous belt of territory that the Russians control from Pyshinya, Zalizny, all the way to New York itself. It does seem as if the Ukrainians still control part of the very northern edge of New York. So earlier reports that New York had been fully captured by the Russians are not correct yet, but it's hardly likely that the Ukrainians will be able to retain the rest of New York for very long. The Ukrainians still control Nelipivka, which is the last remaining village south of Toretsk. But the Russians also, it seems, are now moving westwards from New York. They've almost reached Alexandropil, and it's now only a question of time before the Russians start clearing up all of these remaining villages which lie to the west of Toretsk, further complicating, by the way, Ukrainian supply lines west to the grouping in Toretsk itself. And perhaps more dramatic still, it seems that the Russians not only are in the process of clearing the two coal mines which lie to the south of Toretsk, but in the Druzhba area in the north, they have now entered the metropolitan area, the built-up area of Toretsk itself. The Ukrainians don't have enough troops to hold them back, despite the fact that there are large numbers of brigade formations from the Ukrainian army located around Toretsk. But the Russian offensive in Toretsk continues relentlessly, and it's now becoming increasingly clear that the whole Toretsk battle is progressing at catastrophic speed, with the Russians very close, it seems to me, to breaking through to central Toretsk, and with the possibility of this entire urban area, this entire fortified urban area close to Gorlovka, formerly under Ukrainian control, falling to the Russians, opening another route for the Russians to advance towards Konstantinovka and Chasiv Yar from the south. Just saying. The fall of Toretsk, to make it clear, would be a disaster for the Ukrainians. It would be the biggest blow that the Ukrainians would have suffered in the entire conflict so far. If the Ukrainians lose Toretsk, then it would indeed be the case that there would be a critical situation for the entire Ukrainian grouping in Donbas. And of course, if the Ukrainians lose Pokrovsk as well, the major supply place, and if they also lose Chasiv Yar over the next few weeks, and it's quite plausible that they will, then the entire Ukrainian position in central Donbas will be on the verge of collapse. The Russians will be able to attack the city of Konstantinovka from multiple directions. Once Konstantinovka falls, all that's left, essentially, are Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. And at that point, I think that those two big towns would become virtually undefendable. Anyway, that's running ahead of events a little. Now, there's been a dearth of reports about what's going on in the Chasiv Yar area. We know that the Russians are west of the aqueduct in central Chasiv Yar. We also know that the Ukrainians transferred troops from Chasiv Yar to assist to conduct the operation in Kursk region, which seems like an incredibly reckless thing to do. in this situation. It may suggest, by the way, that the Ukrainian command has written off Chasiv Yar, which would be an extraordinary thing if it was the case. If one looks at a map, if Chasiv Yar falls and Toretsk falls, Konstantinovka is taken into a pincer. It's impossible to see that the Ukrainian defences in Konstantinovka could hold out for very long, especially given that Konstantinovka, relative to Chasiv Yar itself, is apparently on low ground. But anyway, we've had less news from Chasiv Yar. I think it's largely because the Ukrainians don't want to disclose very much of what is happening there. And the Russians have a practice that when they are advancing, they don't tell us very much. So the situation in Chasiv Yar is unclear. But I strongly suspect that when we do get more news from Chasiv Yar, we will have learnt that the Russians have occupied substantial further parts of it. And further north, there are now reports not only that the Russians are making significant progress in the Kupiansk area, but that because, again, the Ukrainians are short of men in the Kupiansk area because all the reserves have been sent to Kursk, that the key village of Sinkovka, close to Kupiansk, the village where the Ukrainians were able to stop the Russian advance on Kupiansk back in the autumn, that Sinkovka itself is coming under Russian control. Now, again, I have no absolute confirmation that this is actually the case, but there are reports to this effect. Certainly, the Russians seem to have surrounded or be close to surrounding a small group of Ukrainian soldiers in further villages east of the Oskol and Zherebets rivers, further south. But of course, if Sinkovka has indeed fallen or is about to fall, then the Russians are literally outside Kupiansk. An attack on Kupiansk would become inevitable. And to be frank, I think that certainly the area of Kupiansk, east of the Oskol River, would rapidly fall under Russian control. And lastly, far from slackening their attempts to gain control of Volchansk, group of forces north is apparently reinforcing in Volchansk. They're committing more troops there because, again, they sense that the Ukrainian forces in the Kharkiv region are being denied reinforcements and supplies because Ukrainian reinforcements and supplies are being concentrated in the area in Kursk region, trying to hold on to these villages that the Ukrainians have captured and perhaps to capture a few more. And the key defense area of the high-rise buildings as a result, it does seem, is about to fall. Now, just to say this once again, all of these places, every one of these places we've discussed, Volchansk, Kupiansk, Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, Krasnogorovka, Pokrovsk, Vuhledar, they're all far big. Konstantinovka, the town of Konstantinovka, near Chasiv Yar. These are far bigger, much more important places than any of the places that the Ukrainians occupy in Kursk. As I said, the town of Suja, which the Ukrainians at one point claimed that they captured, but which the Russians appear to be in the process of recapturing, has a population of between 5 and 6,000, or some people say 5,000, some people say 6,000, but it's a small place. None of these places has any strategic significance at all. If the Ukrainians lose any one of the towns that I've just catalogued in Donbas, listed in Donbas. It is a disaster, and if they lose all of them, it is a catastrophe. And losing all of them is close to where we're getting. Now, it's a fluid situation. What the Ukrainians are going to do next, I'm not able to say, but as I said, it's a dynamic situation. The Ukrainians would be very well advised, in my opinion, to call a stop to the whole thing and to pull back. Doesn't seem as if Zelensky wants it. Zelensky always gets what he wants. It's one of the most extraordinary facts about the Ukrainian conduct of the war, the extent to which a person who has no military background or aptitude seems to have extraordinary powers of command over what is, after all, a regular army. Anyway, he apparently wants to dig in. For him, the prestige loss of pulling out from Kursk apparently outweighs the disastrous situation that is building up in Donbas, provided he can keep the media attention on the fact that the Ukrainians are on what the whole world acknowledges is Russian territory. This is more important than for the places like Volchansk, Chasiv Yar, Ukr Toretsk, Vuhledar, or that kind of thing. Obviously, I'm overstating things, but I would not be surprised if this is how some Ukrainian officials feel. And by the way, you can get some hint of this from some of the things that they have been saying to the Western media. Anyway, if the Russians did lay a trap for the Ukrainians, then the Ukrainians have walked right into it. I still have difficulty, as I said, quite believing that. But, that's what I have been told, and I know that that is what increasing numbers of people believe. I don't think the events quite bear that out, but anyway, there it is. If, on the other hand, the Ukrainians walked into a trap of their own making, in some ways, that would be even more astonishing. I get the sense that most of Ukraine's military backers, those who have an understanding of war, are very, very skeptical, to put it mildly, of this operation. But there it is. We'll probably get more news about it over the course of the next 24 hours. And I think, just to say quickly, I think if over the course of the next week, if the Ukrainians haven't achieved any further breakthroughs, we can start to say that this operation, in its most important sense, is over. Though I don't think we're quite at that point yet. But anyway, I will return to discuss further things. I see that commentary about the conflict in the Middle East has now switched again. It seems that the Americans are again worrying that the Iranians really are planning some major strike on Israel after all. I will return to all of those topics in my next program. But in the meantime, all that remains again is for me to remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, and X, and others. Please remember that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where you will find lots of amazing things, hats, hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all those great things. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.